So let me welcome everyone to the Wendland-Cook program in Religion and Justice's new webinar series on religion and labor. Today's session is titled Tense Relations, Exploring the Problems and Promise of Labor and Religion. My name is Joerg Rieger. I am the director of the Wendland-Cook program, and I'm also a professor of theology at Vanderbilt University Divinity School. I will be moderating today's discussion, and I'm very excited to have a very distinguished group of panelists that I will be introducing in just a moment. Again, welcome to everybody who has already joined us and who will be joining us. At the Wendland-Cook program in Religion and Justice, we're investigating how various religions can contribute to a better world. Our question is, how can religion become part of the solution rather than staying part of the problem? Aided by liberative theologies developed around the world, we see hope emerging in unexpected places. And we're finding that those who are most affected by the pressures of our age are not just victims. They're also becoming agents, and in many cases, even leaders. In this climate, we seek to contribute our part to a re-emerging spirit of solidarity that was long declared missing, or perhaps even simply impossible. In this webinar, we seek to go deeper into the relationship between religion and labor, exploring historic and contemporary challenges and opportunities between theology, faith communities, and the labor movement. As Rosemary Henkel-Rieger and I have noted in our book titled Unified, We Are a Force, faith and labor can form powerful alliances that make a real difference in people's lives. Moreover, this difference extends to all areas of life, we believe, transforming not only economics, but also politics, community, culture, and ultimately even religion itself. Keep in mind that faith and labor conversations address not only matters of social class, I guess people expect that, but they're also addressing matters of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, and ultimately, as we've shown in previous webinars, even matters of ecology. Before we jump into the conversation, let me provide a few instructions on how audience participation will work. Please note the chat function of the webinar is open, and we encourage posting of questions, comments, or any clarification or technical issues that you may have with the webinar. Chat comments will be visible to everyone, and we'll monitor them and feed some of those questions back to the panelists for a short Q&A section at the end of our webinar. Please note that we'll also monitor questions that are asked on the Facebook live stream, so hopefully we'll get those into the conversation as well. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. As I said earlier, this is a distinguished panel, and I'm tremendously excited to have them with us today. I'll go in alphabetical order. First is Charles E. Clark, Sr., who is the National Community Engagement Coordinator of the National AFL-CIO with offices, his offices are in Atlanta. He's also the co-pastor of the New Life Church of God in Christ in Montgomery, Alabama. Welcome, Charles. Great to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Next on my list is Bill Fletcher Jr., who has been an activist and also involved in unions since his teen years. He's the former president of TransAfrica Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, an editorial board member of blackcommentator.com, and he's in the leadership of several other projects. Thank you so much for joining us, Bill. Then we're going to Rabbi Shana Mackler, who has been serving as a rabbi at the temple in Nashville, and she's done so since her ordination at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati. Prior to that, Shana earned her Master's of Arts in Hebrew Letters from HUC and graduated Phi Beta Kappa from the University of Florida. It's great to have you with us, Shana.
Thank you.
And finally, last but certainly not least, is Vonda McDaniel, who is the president of the Central Labor Council of Nashville and Middle Tennessee of the AFL-CIO, and she's a lifelong member of the First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill here in Nashville. Vonda is also a member of the Wendland-Cook Program's Steering Committee. Welcome, Vonda.
Thank you.
So with all of us here together, let me ask my first question, not right away about religion and labor, but about the importance of labor, because I think we have to establish this as well. In an earlier webinar on religion, economics, and ecology, we observed that in the United States, many social movements have tended to call for change to political and social institutions, but not for change to economic institutions. We might also say that while most Americans are aware of the importance of engagement in politics, there is less of an awareness of the importance of engagement in matters of the economy and of labor in particular. So let me ask you this, what's going on and how might we reclaim the importance of labor in the United States today? And let me pose this question to Vonda McDaniel first.
Thank you, Joerg. So what's going on? Actually, today is a National Day of Action for the AFL-CIO. We are on the brink of the CARES Act, which passed in April, is now about to expire. And we are trying to make sure that the benefits in a state like Tennessee, where the unemployment rate, the unemployment benefit is $275 a week, that there is some income support. We're also seeing that outbreaks of COVID are impacting many of our construction work sites, our hospitality industry, which is the engine that drives the economy in the state of Tennessee. So we are, as labor, trying to make sure that folks are able to participate actively in the decisions that impact their life and their work. And this is a challenging time, especially for workers, not just in Tennessee, but all around the country.
Maybe sometimes people think when we say workers, this is a few people that we might, meet at the grocery store or somewhere. But when, in the days of Occupy Wall Street, we discovered that 99% of us ultimately have to work for a living. So this population of working people is really very large, and many people have talked about the working majority when they have talked about the United States. And so having these activities, I think, could be really helpful to see how we're all in this together. But let me put this question next to Charles Clark. How might we reclaim the importance of labor in the United States today?
I think that's a good question. I grapple with one word you said, and that is reclaim, as if we've somewhere in the past had a moment where we were all in this together and rolling together and building leverage and power. I think that there's a lot that can be done. This is a complex issue. I think that given the kind of rhetoric that corporate America and right-wing conservatives have spewed out, and it has brainwashed a lot of folks against labor, and I think there's this disconnect between our work life and our spiritual life. And so a lot of folks don't always connect what I'm doing at work with what I'm doing at church, and vice versa. And so I think that in terms of reclaim or claim, somehow we've got to mitigate that gap and figure out how do we have conversations with labor leaders and with church leaders to show the commonality between the two, and that there is a path forward for both of us together, building the kind of leverage and power that we need for working families.
Thank you. I think a lot of religious leaders and even people of faith somehow assume that religion has to do with leisure time, you know, rather than work time. The reality is, of course, everything is always connected. So thank you for that reminder. Let me pose this question to Rabbi Shana. What's your take on that?
I agree that in the past, most recently, that the term labor or the idea of unions has been tainted and vilified as something antithetical to the American dream or to the American democracy practice. I think that needs to be something that we reclaim to show that all of the protections and rights and collective impact and influence that workers have is something that we need to elevate again. I think that is most exposed, as Vonda mentioned, now with COVID and all of the essential workers, quote unquote, essential workers. I think people that may not be part of the labor movement recognize how essential labor is and how protective it has been for each and every worker. So the idea that we can use this moment as we see the power of social movements in the streets now and in the, you know, I would say the revolutions that we're feeling the seeds of right now, I think that we can use this moment as the springboard for more acceptance and amplifying the labor movement once again.
Thank you. I find it encouraging to hear both you and Reverend Charles as religious professionals say that there is some real interest and some real importance to this conversation. So thanks, and we'll get into the religion and labor question in a moment. Bill, we'll conclude this first round of questioning with you. What are your thoughts on how to reclaim the importance of labor in the U.S. today?
I think one of the difficulties in talking about labor in the United States historically is that class has been presented as somehow an irrelevant category in the United States, that it might have applied to Europe and other parts of the world, but doesn't apply here. And part of what made that possible, that illusion, was race. And that the construction of race led many so-called white people to believe that they had common interests, not with other laboring peoples, but with people higher up the food chain that happened to share the same skin shade. And I think that this has been a problem that has always made it difficult in building a real labor movement in the United States. And after World War II, it became even more complicated because the living standard was going up. And people were gaining the victories as a result of both the existence of a labor movement that had reemerged, as well as the premier situation facing the United States after the war. And unfortunately, organized labor didn't do enough to both expand its ranks, but also to speak on behalf of all working people. It became very self-centered, and we're reaping what we sow. So I think that what we're seeing now is a lot of rebellion, a lot of struggle that's underway. We have real opportunities, but we have to build organization. It can't just be protests.
Thank you so much. This is really crucial parts of our conversation that we need to be following up. Let me also mention that in the Wendland-Cook program, we currently started a new blog series on race and class. So if you go to the blog, there are several interviews with some of our academic colleagues that precisely talk about this issue that Bill just mentioned in his presentation. And it seems to me as we move forward together, cutting through some of these misunderstandings, whether they are based on religion, whether they're based on racism, whether they're based on just faulty analysis as to who is a working person, may be absolutely crucial. And let me maybe add at the very end, again, what I said earlier, the reminder that labor is not a minority concern. If 99% of us have to work for a living, and you know, people who oftentimes do not have much power at work are ultimately in majority in this country, we might have to think about that again. Plus, what's oftentimes overlooked is that people spend the bulk of their waking hours at work. It's probably nowhere else, maybe in bed at night, where you're spending more of your time in block than you're spending at work. So labor here is much more important than we usually give it credit. And that's, of course, the move on to religion, where I think in some ways there's this misunderstanding that those two have very little to do with each other. What I found, this is now my second complex of questions, and we want to spend more time with this one. When you look at the relation of religion and labor, this is only now an emerging field. This is something that we're only now getting into. Well, you could say maybe people were into it a long time ago, but not in any recent memory. I visited an academic website recently where there were over 27,000 people interested in the topic of religion and politics. And when I clicked on the topic of religion and labor, there were only three individuals compared to 27,000 people. So that tells you something. Moreover, not only is there a lack of interest, I would argue there is a good deal of hostility, as those of us in religious communities know. When you start talking about labor, it doesn't always go over well, and there are good reasons for that. Now, this was not always the case. About 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, religion and labor together won decisive victories from which all of us are still benefiting today. Those victories include ending child labor, gaining slowly but surely labor rights for women, 8-hour workdays, weekends off work, pension plans, and the list goes on and on. Much of this was won, certainly with the leadership of the unions, but with strong support of a lot of the mainline congregations. So in this light, with all the tensions that we're seeing, with the history that we have, let me put this question to the panelists. How might we think about the connection of labor and religion again in more positive terms today, and what are the problems that we have to overcome?
So, Joerg, I would offer a more recent example. In my introduction, you mentioned that I was a product of First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill. But First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill is a touchstone for what was the connections between labor and the faith community in the civil rights movement. When we think about C.T. Vivian and John Lewis, my own pastor, Kelly Miller Smith Sr., you know, those were the leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They were also the leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Much of the funding for the work that they were able to do, the structure that they were able to build, came from more progressive unions. So I think that there is a blueprint for the kind of partnership that the faith community can have with labor. And if you would just, especially in Tennessee, Tennessee is the headquarters to at least 4 national faith organizations in the Black community. The AME Church, the CME Church, the Church of God in Christ, and the National Baptist Convention. Collectively, they represent about 20 million people. And so there are definitely opportunities when you combine the power of just those church faith organizations and the labor movement to do tremendous work, especially in the South.
Thank you so much, Vonda. And I mean, just to highlight what was implicit in your comments also, that in that history, the Black church and Black Christians, Black leaders, Black ministers have made a tremendous difference. And I think maybe that goes to Bill's earlier comment about, how do we overcome these things? And so it's very hopeful in so many ways what we're seeing. Thank you.
Comment here, Joerg, from Charles. I really think that we're at a juncture, a point, a place where a lot of positive can come out of labor and religion coming together. When you look at these crises that we're dealing with, the health crisis, economic crisis, and this racial crisis, this is a moment where religion and faith needs to look at what Jesus taught, the moral values that we believe in, and couple that with what labor's mission is to improve the lives of workers. It's a moment that we can come together to make some positive change. However, I think there are some real strong differences that will lessen the opportunity to kind of make the stride that we can make. There's going to be some, and I think there are places and pockets all across the country where faith and labor working together. I personally have worked with some of these across the country. And so you're going to see this, but I think exponentially to see the kind of progress that we can make, there are some inherent problems that I think need to be overcome in order to make those. And I'm sure we'll probably get to some of those later.
But what's crucial here, let me just sum that up, is this is not just a pious idea of ours, not just that we think this should happen, but it's already happening. And Vonda talked about seeing it happen. You're talking about seeing it happen around the country in many places. And unfortunately, we don't have the media right now that would report on it much, but this is the word that needs to get out. So thank you.
I think one of the things that we can do is to teach that history. I think people often rely on the gains that have been made because of labor, and we don't recognize the work that went into it and don't lift up those stories and that history to tell us why we have the 8-hour workday or the day off or the health and safety protections. I think when we can explicitly name those and shout it again from our pulpits and continue to talk about it, just like when we talk about racial justice or economic justice or environmental justice, all of these things are actually connected. We may say that it's separate, religion and politics versus religion and labor. But I think if we change it to policy and not politics, you'll see that they're much more connected. So when we talk about environmental protections as a religious value, we know that those environmental protections are there to keep workers safe. When we talk about the cost of human dignity, we talk about wages and labor, we're talking about all of the same things, or non-discrimination, right? If we talk about policies, we can connect that passion for being involved in the political realm with the voice and the importance of labor. We can make room and have people sit at the table. Whenever we have those discussions, we can invite labor in as religious institutions back into the conversation if we've been neglecting them. And I think religious voices, particularly progressive religious voices, need to be much more into the public sphere, right? We don't want to abdicate that role and that responsibility to either the far right or voices that don't advocate for labor and and justice, we need to reclaim that.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, the history is there. I think that's the exciting thing. Plus, I always remind people that, you know, if most of us have to work for a living, the issue is there in our religious congregations and communities because we bring it with us. We cannot leave that somewhere at the door as we enter in our religious activities. Bill?
I want to just add, and I'm speaking not as a theologian, I'm not particularly religious. I think that we have to situate this problem in a broader context. I would argue that there has been a split in all three of the Abrahamic religions from almost the beginning as to whether or not the religion is a religion for the oppressor or for the oppressed, whether it's for authority or the people that are stomped on by authority, whether it's the religion of the emperor or of the peasant. And I think that this split, and you see it, whether it's in Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, is very, very present. And thus you can have this dichotomy between, for example, those who embrace the prosperity gospel and those who embrace liberation theology. And that's just two examples. And so when we're talking about the relationship of religion and labor, I think we have to be clear. We're actually not talking about the relationship of religion and labor. We're talking about the relationship between a segment of the religious community and labor. Because there's a segment of the religious community that is very clear in terms of their antipathy towards unions, antipathy towards the poor, antipathy towards the dispossessed, and their embrace of those in the elite. And I don't think we should mull over that difference. I think it's very fundamental. I mean, I was raised as a Christian. Why I'm not a practicing Christian is a whole other discussion. But I was raised as a Christian, but I was raised with a certain idea that Jesus was a revolutionary. That this whole issue of miracles was secondary to him being a revolutionary. And that was very central to the kind of notion that I entered into, and also in some ways helps to explain why I went down and became went down a path of trade unionism. I think another thing, when you're mentioning about 100 years ago, the relationship between certain parts of Christianity and Judaism and the labor movement, I think it's also important to recognize that a lot of that had to do with the European immigrant experience. European immigrants coming over to the United States, and the religion was part of the bond to hold the communities together. And there was a good fit. But a lot of things have changed as those Europeans ceased to be immigrants and basically became white people. And also in connection to that there's been a struggle in the realm of faith, particularly with the reemergence of right-wing populism that has grabbed the mantle of religion and is trying to beat everyone over the head with it. So I think we have to just expand the context a little bit.
Thank you so much for that comment. While you said you're not a theologian, I wish that more theologians would heed what you just said, because those are crucial differences. Those are crucial differences also in how people imagine, anything in their religion, all the way up to the divine. And I think, there's a knee-jerk reaction where even, a lot of, well-meaning people of faith, when you say who is God, would imagine God in terms of, a power that resembles either an emperor, pharaoh in ancient Egypt, perhaps a powerful politician or CEO today, rather than a working person. Now, this is the beauty of the Abrahamic traditions. And I mean, there's beauty in many other religions also, but what I find in the Abrahamic traditions here is there's so many images of God as a working person. You find this in the Hebrew Bible. You find it in the creation story. One of the stories that Jews, Christians, and Muslims share is God planting a garden and God making Adam from clay. Not God making other people plant gardens and work hard, and not sort of God being the heavenly CEO, but working. And then the tradition that all three Jews, Christians, and Muslims share is the Exodus tradition, where, as far as I'm concerned, the miracle of God in the burning bush is not just that this bush burns and doesn't get consumed, but that God says, I have heard the cry of these slaves, my people, and here we will go and liberate them. Those are powerful stories, and you cannot have it both ways. This is just simply agreeing with what Bill already said, but those I think are some of the problems that have to be overcome if we want to bring religion and labor more closely together. Let's go a second round and see what else you would like to add to this broad question of how do we bring religion and labor together again in positive terms today in our own time.
So I see in the chat that some of my comrades from the Gamaliel organization here in Nashville, NOAA, I think that building deep solidarity, the term that I learned from you, Joerg, it's very important, especially in this moment. I think that unions and faith organizations face similar challenges in a society that tries to demonize institutions and make people distrustful of them. Seeing the exemplified solidarity of institutions that have such deep history, I think can help to bring a new generation of people into both institutions that we so desperately need. Figuring out and sharing organizing strategies is not something that often happens, but I think should happen more often. So, just those are some of my thoughts around how we can work together in this moment to build both very important and needed institutions in this moment.
Thank you.
Well, Bill Fletcher made some comments, and I thought he hit several points, but he prompted me to think about a lot of my own experiences in my church, in a lot of the churches and temples and faith-based organizations that I've worked with around the country. And that is this: people can be in the house of God and praise the Lord and shout and do Bible study. But when you bring up the topic of politics and policy, when you start talking about who's the best candidate to govern the country, then you see this segment. You see the isolation, which then prompts me to think about, okay, what are some of the problems that cause this? Why are we able to worship in the same house, but yet when you start talking about politics and policy, then there's a difference. And so when you start talking about these problems that kind of cause us to keep from joining labor and politics together, I think sometimes our upbringing, our background, our belief can bring about this isolation, and I'm looking for another word, this situation where the church, the faith as a whole, can't get behind any one thing because the church itself is split. And so I think part of our biggest challenge here is trying to get faith leaders, those in the churches, to understand that there is a common goal here between labor and the church and faith. And I'm not quite sure what the answer is. I know the other distinguished colleagues on the panel will be able to give that out, but I just know that we got to keep working at it to overcome it. And I'll kind of pause and see if anybody else has anything.
For me, I think part of overcoming that is standing in solidarity and finding partners and partnerships where you can. I think sometimes we have this this feeling like if we don't agree on every single thing, we can't possibly work together on anything. And I think just as we don't want to, you know, sort of group all religious leaders and all religious experiences together, we can't do that with the unions either. And we can't do that with the policies. I really think that we have to figure out how to work together and how to elevate or amplify those places, those intersections where we can meet. And whether it's with immigration, whether it's with women's rights, whether it's with wages, I think that we can find those historical pieces and those text pieces that will give legs or give validity for some, that this is a religious obligation, that this is part of our practice that we must do. I come from a tradition that is based more in deed than in creed. So we have action as our mandate. Those are our commandments. What you believe is between you and God, but you have a job to do with other people. And the Reformed Jewish tradition celebrates the unions from our history, as you mentioned, Bill, coming over, and it has changed as people moved out of certain tenements and they had different experiences. Their focus on labor has changed, but our obligation as a religious group and as believers and practicers of our tradition has not changed. And that's, I think, where we need to remind people is that the text is the same, right? It's always been the same. Don't abuse a destitute or weary laborer. You know, don't take a worker's garment and pawn. Don't abuse and overpower the powerless. Right. And as you mentioned, the Exodus story talks about two people who revolted and spoke truth to power. Right. These two midwives, whether they were Hebrew midwives or midwives for Hebrew women, you know, we can have that argument. But what we do know is that these two women who were workers low on the totem pole of power in Egypt overturned the system. Right. They got all of, you know, the community to rebel and to stand up to that that experience, which led to that liberation. And I think those are those moments we need to recover and retell and reframe, if it's necessary, into the positive work of revolution and rebellion when it comes to organizing for powerful social change.
This was actually a question that was just posted and put to me via the blog. Namely, you know, how do we retell this story of liberation? Thank you so much, Shana, for that, because what's oftentimes forgotten, it's not just Moses doing great things. There's lots of women, the two midwives that you mentioned. Then there's Moses' sister that's involved. In Islam, actually, very interesting, Pharaoh's wife switches sides and supports the slaves. So there is all kinds of actions here, but what's clear is you have to take sides. It's not a matter of God sitting above everything and say, you know, I like everybody here, but God realizes there has to be liberation, and then the whole thing gets to work. It's a complex story. We don't have time to go into it, but that's part of these Abrahamic traditions. That's pretty amazing. And that points not only to some revolutionary action on the ground, but the whole universe sort of reverberates with that, including whatever people think of as the divine. But Bill, you have the final comment on this question before we move on?
Yeah, I was just going to say that it has always struck me that when religious forces unite with labor, they really do bring soul into the movement, and that they help to transform the movement away from a mechanical process focused on wages, hours, and working conditions into a cause. And I don't think that can be overstated, because given what we're up against, if you don't believe in something bigger than yourself, whether that is God or whether that is your conception of humanity or whatever, you will ultimately be crushed and you will fall into despair. And I think that this is something that becomes very important. And so when I look at the sort of liberation theologian traditions with a small L and a small t in the Abrahamic faiths, I look at those who have sided with the oppressed, those who have been unapologetic in siding with the oppressed, those who have faced immense consequences by siding with the oppressed. And that's the kind of inspiration that we need within labor. And related to something that someone asked, labor is correctly, is itself split on this and split on its mission. And I think that those, I'm going to call it the pro-oppressed segment of the religious tradition, are allies in a transformation of labor.
So what we're seeing here, this is also striking to me, that in a way, as you bring these two together, there is something that, a labor commitment does to religion, namely it sort of deepens it. It helps us see what is that religion, that we're talking about, say, in the Abrahamic traditions. I've done work with engaged Buddhists. Great question for Buddhism also. So labor here grounds some of these religious conversations, yet at the same time, religion might bring something to labor that's more than just a blessing. It's really a way of perhaps even radicalizing labor when we say God is actually taking sides. There's a Hebrew notion of justice that we're sometimes forgetting today, that also shaped Christianity, that says justice is God taking the side of the oppressed, God taking the side of the victims, restoring the covenant, something like that. Whereas in our Roman influenced traditions, we think of justice as neutrality, hovering above an issue, whereas there's a much more engaged way of thinking about that. Let me remind the audience that this is also now our time for questions. So feel free to put your questions to us, and I will feed them to the panelists. Let me start with a question that came in specifically for Charles from the New Hampshire Faith and Labor Coalition. And here, they're just wanting to know what are some stories of successes in bringing faith and labor that you have seen as the national community coordinator for the AFL-CIO?
Well, there are several. One would be in New Jersey. Actually went up to Jersey City, working with one of our affiliates who was working on a contract with the hospital, the Med Center in Jersey City. And the Board of Commissioners, County Commissioners, had a meeting of which they were the decision makers around this contract. And part of my job was to bring faith-based leaders together to stand with these workers at this particular commission meeting. And but the hospital and the Chamber of Commerce had put out notification that they were not going to let anyone speak, including clergy. So at this particular night, about 100 workers piled into the meeting. About 20 to 30 clergy, and these were heads of churches, rabbis, Church of God in Christ, and the commission attempted to shut the clergy down and say, we've heard, we know, and we don't want to hear no more. And those pastors stood up, walked to the front, all of them, and said, you are going to hear our story and you're not going to put us out. And they proceeded to talk about how important these workers are and how important it is to them as faith-based leaders to stand on the side of these workers. And we stayed there for 3 hours at night listening to clergy as they preach basically to this commission. And it was beautiful. But at the end of the day, we ended up getting a contract about a week later, but having a lot of faith-based and community leaders joining in this process. And of course, I could probably go on and on, St. Louis, Mississippi, a lot of places, but that was just an example.
There are quite a few questions now, and let me encourage people to post more of them. I'll probably combine a few of them because we cannot get to everything in about 10 or 15 minutes that we have left. So as you think about these examples, and this is now also to the other panelists, someone wondered about what is the bond that brings people together? That person wondered, is there a bond? I mean, there may not be many bonds in our society today, except football. That was the comment. What would it be that would help us create? We talked about solidarity a few times now. Something like solidarity, and perhaps do you have some examples for that?
So, Joerg, I'll go. I see my friend and comrade and thought partner, Jamal Craig, raised the model that A. Philip Randolph and James Orange, who was a minister who was a part of the march from Selma to Montgomery, but also later became an organizer for the AFL-CIO, and how the relationship between many of the ministers that came during that period. It was E.D. Nixon who was responsible for us even knowing who Martin Luther King was, a Pullman porter. And so the integral relationship that union leaders, particularly Black union leaders, had in their communities, and the linkages with the labor movement were strong, and I think worthy of study. Duplicating them in this time, this is a new time that has new demands. But I think that there is much to be learned and gleaned from the relationships that A. Philip Randolph had with faith leaders all over the country, and how they provided a real structure for much of the social change of that moment.
So religion could be part of that thing that keeps us together. If we keep in mind the fact that religion is not always the same and functions in the same way. So finding the right strains here might be part of that response. If I could put one question that sort of goes along with this back to Bill Fletcher, who earlier stated that we need to build organizations, that we need to build power, pushing beyond protesting. Now, I mean, none of us I know on this panel would think that protesting is not important, but I think we're at a point where it might be very helpful to say, here's the protests, here's what they have accomplished. How do we build? So what kinds of organizations might we have to build? How do we start building a new economy that works for all, bringing together not just labor unions, but people of faith, people that work for justice more broadly. So I mean, since you brought this up, Bill, I wonder what your thoughts might be.
I want to respond by first saying, I think that there are many bonds or potential bonds. And one that we shouldn't forget is class. And the issue of, I mean, this is really where it does come down to which side are you on? Are you on the side of the employer class, the rich and the avaricious, or are you on the side of people that have to work in order to survive? And so to me, that's a very fundamental issue. And unfortunately, it's not always an apparent bond because of other glasses that people wear at different junctures. But I think that to your question about organization, multiple organizations, we need a new labor movement. And we need people invigorated. You know, when I look at the response to the George Floyd murder, when I look at the COVID crisis, when I looked at the introduction of DHS troops into our cities, I'm saying, well, like, where is labor as a movement? I don't mean where is an individual union, but I mean, where is labor as a movement? And we need to be building or rebuilding labor as a movement. And that means that we need leaders who are willing to take risks, that are not primarily concerned about preserving their pension, but people that really are focused on how do we defeat our opponents. So I think we need organizations on different levels. We need neighborhood associations, we need political parties, but I think we definitely need a rebuilt labor movement.
Following up on this notion of class, and thanks so much for raising that, you know, putting that together with religion, since we're asking about the bond that ties us together, might be a very fruitful conversation. Going back to the Hebrew slaves one more time, you could argue there was an ethnic bond, of course, but there was also a class bond, right? And what's so amazing in that story is that ultimately God joins in that bond as well, right? So there is a way of bringing things together. And, you know, I have often thought, I have actually argued this, some of it is on the blog of the Wendland-Cook program, that this may be one of the effective ways, not the only one, but one to address racism. You know, how do we build an awareness among white workers, for instance, that they may have more in common with the black fellow worker than with the white boss, which is what the system of racism suggests to them, right? If your boss is doing well, you're doing well. Well, maybe that's not true. And so this is where I think part of that reconstructing that you're calling from is also coming in. Mm-hmm. If I could ask Shana, this is sort of where we're moving fast towards the end of our conversation. I really appreciated your comment about Judaism being more about deed than creed. In my own theology as a Christian, you know, I have often said that creed really springs from deed. And the fact that we have so many bad creeds, I think, has to do with the fact that our praxis is also not that great. But here's a question from somebody who's listening to the webinar. How do we activate our people, our communities? Because in their experience, which is also mine, very oftentimes we see faith leaders when, say, maybe we have a protest or a labor action, but what happens, you know, how do we bring in the people that make up the community?
I think for our sake, you know, when I do teaching, I remind them that synagogues are supposed to be built with a window in the chapel, so that you remind yourselves that, you know, what you pray for inside the chapel has to be lived outside, right? And the matters of outside have to be brought in to talk about those concerns from outside. You have to have that window in order to be able to live out your practice, you know, live out your religion. I I think role modeling, if your faith leaders are not there, I think that's a problem. So to have faith leaders at protest, I think is an integral step. But I also think that we need to do basic organizing in our congregations. I know the work that we do with NOAA is pivotal in our community, to have our areas and our unions collectively together with houses of worship, that we tap people so that it's not just a top-down message, that it's actually lived out. So we have justice committees and we have our NOAA participants, and the basic practice of organizing is that they'll tap 5 people who will tap 5 people, and you have to build that into the system. And a lot of times I think we've personalized religion so much, and people say I'm spiritual, not religious, and it's all very internal. And I think that we have to remind people, even in a tradition that is much more on action with the belief underpinning all of it, we have to remind people that it's not a personal practice. This is not about just your relationship with God or what God can do for you. It's what you can do for other human beings, and how we work together to create a just society. And really, I think that's where we can find those messages that can grab a hold of people. You give them something to do, and you give them that challenge and show them why it's important and why it should be part of who they are and what if they say that they're a believer, put your actions where your beliefs are.
Yeah. Thank you so much. All of you have given us so much to think about. There are more questions. I wish we could go for a second hour, because we're only just warming up in this important conversation. Unfortunately, we're at the closing. We're at the end of our time. So let me thank, first of all, the panelists for their tremendously helpful insights. And I know that stirred some really cool questions that we will be following up here within the Wendland-Cook program. This is the kind of work that we're doing, namely bringing these questions back to the table. What does it mean for rethinking religion? What does it mean for rethinking the labor movement? We may not have much of a say in that, but with powerful people like Vonda McDaniel and Charles Clark on this team, you have an input, you have a foot in the door, right? With Bill Fletcher reminding us, really keeping us on our toes, where power has to be built, and how all these important issues have to be addressed together, race and class, and of course also gender, moving on to questions of ethnicity and sexuality and so on. And then Shana, thank you so much for that grounded religious perspective that really helps us see how we can start organizing again. NOAA, that was mentioned, is Nashville Organizing for Action and Hope, a local group here that some of our listeners may not know. But I know there are many listeners from around the country, from other organizations. We heard from New Hampshire, their friends from CLU, Clergy Laity, Organized for Religion and Justice, I'm not sure I got this quite right, but CLU in Los Angeles that have joined us, Interfaith Worker Justice, and in many other places. So stay with us, come back. This is the next steps now. I would like to remind all of our listeners at the end, as this growing awareness rises, that we need to pull these things together, that economic, ecological, cultural, and our religious problems are ultimately interconnected. We want to serve as one of the clearinghouses where we bring these questions together, investigate solutions, and organize our communities based on what we're learning here. The fact that we're collaborating here is important because none of us can do this by themselves. None of us can do it alone. We come from different backgrounds, sometimes even different countries. There was a question about Malaysia that we didn't get to, but we'll keep that in mind as well. But all of us are involved together in movements of liberation. So our invitation at the end is to join us and to understand or help us understand better where we can join you. A couple of announcements. Next steps, the next webinar on religion and labor will be on September the 2nd at 11 a.m. This is the week before Labor Day. Then let me point out our blog series where we just concluded a series on COVID and labor, and we're just now starting a new series I mentioned earlier on class and race. You can sign up in the Wendland-Cook's email list. You can like us on Facebook. And there's a survey. We always take these surveys very seriously. Please fill that one out. And this is it for today. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're looking forward to seeing everyone next time. Thanks and goodbye.